Hello, Professor and esteemed colleagues in the class Innovation. This is Bradford Kelly from Atlanta, Georgia, United States, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes with you going over the gist of my final paper. It's called Concorde Flawed Icon, an analysis of a disruptive and discontinuous innovation that should have changed the world, but didn't. Few aircraft in history have generated as much enthusiasm, controversy, or spectator pleasure as Concorde. The dart-shaped delta-winged aircraft married 1960s cutting-edge technology with stunningly beautiful aesthetics and symmetry to create a showpiece of aviation iconography. Now, much has been made of Concorde's commercial failure and the millions of pounds and French francs that it cost British and French taxpayers. It was originally intended to become the next technological leap in commercial aviation and usher in an era of supersonic air travel for the masses. Concorde instead became a symbol of disruptive innovation without a market, hubris and naivete masking irrational commercial assumptions. But many later successful designs benefited from its technologies, and the manufacturing consortium brought together the two nations' engineers as never before, and it undoubtedly laid the foundations for the later success of Airbus. The Anglo-French Concorde development project, agreed on November 29, 1962, was originally signed as an international treaty between Britain and France rather than as a standard manufacturing agreement, meaning agreement, harmony, or peace. Concorde also meant a unification of sorts between British and French designers, engineers, and politicians. The agreement spurred research and development into supersonic design and technologies, and provided a litmus test for technological cooperation and development between the two countries. The first test flights in 1969 provided a valuable testbed for the commercial applications of the new technologies in development. Concorde entered commercial service in 1976 and successfully flew routes between a number of city pairs, notably Paris and London, to New York and Washington for 27 years. Enthusiastic backers of the project believed the design would prove not only viable, but marketable to the world's airlines and would usher in an era of supersonic air travel for the masses, thus ensuring handsome profits for its developers. Now, while the technology and the design proved workable, and the aircraft flew well, numerous unseen and overlooked obstacles conspired to make the transition from design sheet to economic and market success difficult. There were higher than anticipated development costs, high operational costs, environmental concerns, global crises, a non-existent customer base, and tepid customer response all helped to ensure that Concorde would be a commercial failure, a cutting-edge technological innovation propped up by subsidies from governments and taxpayers. Its operational history. Scheduled flights began on January 21, 1976 on the London-Bahrain and the Paris to Rio routes. The U.S. Congress had just banned Concorde landings in the U.S., mainly due to citizen protest over noise and sonic booms, preventing launch on the coveted transatlantic routes of London to New York, London-Washington, and the Paris-New York and Paris-Washington routes. Now, in spite of complaints about the noise report presented before the court in New York noted that Air Force One, which at the time was a Boeing 707, was actually louder than Concorde at subsonic speeds and during takeoff and landing. Concorde was subsequently given permission to operate service to Washington Dulles, and both Air France and British Airways began service to Washington Dulles on May 24, 1976. Scheduled service from Paris and London to New York's John F. Kennedy Airport began on November 22, 1977. In 1977, British Airways and Singapore Airlines shared a Concorde for flights between London and Singapore via Bahrain. However, the Malaysian government complained of noise, and after 3 flights, British Airways cancelled the service after being instructed to reroute around both India and Malaysia, and the route was deemed unprofitable. Air France flew Concorde twice weekly to Mexico City via Washington or New York from September 1978 to November 1982. The worldwide economic crisis during that period resulted in this route's cancellation, and the last flights were basically empty. And it should be noted that flights to Mexico over U.S. territory were flown at subsonic speeds, with decelerations from Mach 2.02 to Mach 0.95 in order to comply with U.S. court orders prohibiting subsonic flight over U.S. territory. Now, from 1978 to 1980, Dallas-based Bradford F International Airways leased 10 Concordes, 5 each from Air France and British Airways. These were used on subsonic flights between Dallas-Fort Worth and Washington, D.C., flown by Bradford flight crews. In Washington, Air France and British Airways crews then took over for the continuing supersonic flights to London and Paris. These flights were not profitable and typically less than 50% booked, forcing Bradford in May 1980 to end its tenure as the only U.S. Concorde operator. In conclusion, the widespread perception was that despite being an engineering marvel with captivating good looks, Concorde was in fact a money loser, and in some respects that is correct. Although technically sound, she was commercially unsuccessful. She rarely made any money on her flights. Most of her flights were half empty, and there were few routes available, and of those few that existed, only British Airways London-New York or London-Washington Dulles routes were actually profitable. Other, perhaps profitable routes were closed to her because of concerns over noise, sonic booms, and unfavorable routings between destinations. Air France never made any money on her Concorde flights. Concorde seemed more of an image enhancer, an engineering testbed, and a plaything for the rich than anything else. So what went wrong? By and large, high fuel costs were to blame. The global oil crisis of the early to mid-70s did much to ensure that Concorde was a money loser. Her gas-guzzling engines only made sense at high altitudes and supersonic speeds, and in any other flight regime they were grossly inefficient. Even during the taxi from gate to the runway, Concorde would consume fully 2% of her fuel payload, and thus operated with only 2 engines during this phase. Skyrocketing fuel prices in the 70s only exacerbated the problem. British Airways was losing $4 million per year, and Air France was losing as much as $9 million per year. The situation was deemed untenable for the state-owned airlines, and they wisely decided not to pursue development of a second-generation Concorde. Why spend all that money on an aircraft that might use 4 times the fuel to move 1/4 of the passengers of a 747? The hoped-for sales of Concorde to other customers also never materialized. British Airways and Air France each maintained 5 Concordes in their respective fleets, and 4 aircraft remained unsold. It seemed the demise of the Concorde was imminent. But then something interesting happened. In late 1983, Sir John King, the managing director of British Airways, convinced Concorde's owner-operator, the British government, to sell outright its fleet of Concordes to British Airways for £16 million each, plus the first year's profits. And knowing that he had an underpriced asset on his hands, he conducted traveler surveys and found out the Concorde was not as high a priced travel option that most assumed she was. So, over the next few years, he gradually raised ticket prices to match that perception. These higher ticket prices, corporate ownership, a downturn in fuel costs, and a lucrative charter market all helped revive Concorde's fortunes for British Airways. What had been a perennial money loser for British Airways ended up making piles of money. And in its most profitable years, Concorde earned British Airways £50 million, and overall £1.75 billion against operating costs of £1 billion. Air France never made any money on her Concordes, as the aircraft remained in the hands of government. And so well into the 90s, Concorde operated up to 100 charter flights per year with all seats booked, and launched into new destinations such as London, Miami, and London, Barbados. She was making money for British Airways, and things were looking up. Then on July 25th, 2000, Air France Flight 4590 crashed in Gonesse, France, killing all 100 passengers, 9 crew members, and 4 people on the ground. The precipitating factor was later determined to be a punctured fuel tank. Apparently, Concorde had struck a titanium strip left on the runway from a departing Continental Airlines flight. This titanium strip had pierced Concorde's wing and ruptured its fuel tank, causing an engine fire, a rapid pitch up, a descent, and then a crash into a local hotel. The ensuing inquiry found Continental Airlines and one of its mechanics guilty of involuntary manslaughter. So immediately after the crash, British Airways and Air France grounded their fleets to determine the cause of the accident and to retrofit their aircraft to prevent a future recurrence of the disaster. Flights resumed the following year in 2001. In fact, the first flight with passengers was a British Airways flight from London to New York on September 11, 2001. The aircraft landed in New York before the tragedy at the World Trade Center. But the writing by now was on the wall, and because of low passenger numbers following 9/11, increased maintenance costs pushed British Airways and Air France to announce in April 2002 that they were retiring Concorde from service later that year. And the aircraft was by now over 30 years old. Its analog cockpit was out of date, and there was little pressure from competing aircraft to upgrade the Concorde systems. The lack of commitment from management didn't help either. It has been suggested that the parent airlines of Concorde realized that they could make more money from first-class seats on subsonic aircraft than they ever could on Concorde. So Air France stripped its aircraft of parts and held an auction of Concorde parts and memorabilia. One of the aircraft is on display at Charles de Gaulle Airport, one in Toulouse, and one in Germany. One of the aircraft is kept partially functional at Le Bourget near Paris, apparently for testing. British Airways conducted a number of farewell flights to North America and around the United Kingdom. Its fleet eventually retired to Manchester and to Brooklands Museum in Surrey. One Concorde has been retired to Grantley Adams International Airport in Barbados. And in closing, I have learned that we may see a flyby of Concorde at the London Olympics in 2012. Thank you very much for the course, Professor, and thank you very much, fellow students. It has been an honor and a pleasure being in the course with you. Thank you, and good luck.